Okay, part two. So, in part one, we talked about the causes of the Great Depression. What were some of those causes? I'm just going to stand here till someone answers me. I'm just kidding, but I miss being in class with you guys and getting to do stuff like that. Anyways, so we talked about the causes of the Great Depression. We talked about how people were spending money they didn't have, and the factories were making too much, and the people stopped buying stuff because they couldn't afford it anymore. And then we get the stock market speculation and the stock market crash of 1929. And then people go to the bank and they're panicking. And so basically, that all leads to the Great Depression. Well, to make matters worse, as if it wasn't already bad enough, in the Midwest, we get something called the Dust Bowl. So the Dust Bowl, so remember, we had a lot of people that had moved west to take advantage of the fertile soil. We can remember we talked about the Homestead Act where they gave people land. And so basically, we had lots and lots of people moving west to farm. Right. Well, in the late 20s and early 30s, the region entered this huge drought. And so the farms were not doing well anymore. We'd also been practicing these poor farming practices where they had basically just been like sucking all the nutrients up out of the soil and not putting any back in. So then, on top of all of that, now we also get these wind storms that are coming in and picking up all this loose dirt, and it would cause these huge dust clouds, which made conditions completely impossible for farming. You can see in this picture here this massive like wall of dust. So you would have these like huge dust storms that made it impossible to farm and really impossible to live there. In a lot of places, they said that after like particularly bad dust storms, there would be cows just like laying dead in the field, and you could cut them open, and their stomachs would be full of sand, and so just really not good. And so a lot of farmers are going to lose their farms because of this. And so we've already got all this other bad stuff happening in the cities with the factories closing. Well, now the farmers are losing their livelihood as well. And so a lot of them are going to go west in search of work, just really all around like the worst possible conditions for all of this to happen. So we look at some of the consequences of the Great Depression. So, what were some of the impacts of it? Um, so, by 1932, so remember the stock market crash was in 1929. The stock market crash wasn't the cause of the Great Depression. It was more of like a symptom of the Great Depression and kind of was the start of it, but it wasn't the cause. It was almost like you have this house of cards of all these bad economic practices that people had been putting into place, and the stock market crash is just what made them all come tumbling down. So that was in 1929. By 1932, so just 3 years later, the unemployment rate reached 25%, which is 1 in 4 people. I mean, that is a lot. I'm not even sure what we're at right now with the unemployment rate. And a lot of people are looking to this. A lot of people are looking at the Great Depression, and that's why they're worried because this was hard for us to get out of. And so we're all kind of looking right now to see what the government officials are going to do to help us get out of this one. So women, children, and blacks were hit especially hard because they were usually the first ones to be laid off. Um, Unemployed workers who had no savings could not pay their debts. There were a whole bunch of people who lost their homes. You can see this picture here. It says, "Jobless men keep going. We can't take care of our own." So there weren't jobs to go around. Again, people lost their life savings. So they can't pay their mortgages, so they lose their homes. That's going to lead to these things called Hoovervilles. So Herbert Hoover was the president during the Great Depression, well, the beginning of it. And so a lot of people blamed him for the suffering of the poor, basically saying that Herbert Hoover didn't do enough, that he wasn't helping, that he wasn't getting us out of it. And so a lot of people were upset with him. And so they would use his name as almost like mocking him with these Hoovervilles. So these would be like these really big camps of these shacks and tents where people would come together. All the homeless people would come together and create these really big like communities of homeless people in all of these shacks, and they called them Hoovervilles. And they would even do other things like a newspaper, they called it a Hoover blanket, or they would turn their pockets inside out, and they called that Hoover flags. So basically, just kind of poking fun at the fact that they were blaming the president. And there were some things that he did try to do to help, like the Hoover Dam was started. That project was started during this time to try to give people jobs. It just wasn't enough. It didn't really go far enough. So in the next standard, we'll look at what the government did after Herbert Hoover, because he does not get reelected. So yeah, so that's where we will go after this. Bye.